Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Computer Scientist. Tonight, we drift into the twilight world of broken dreams and ambitious hardware, into a console that promised to revolutionize gaming, into the story of Atari's final desperate grasp at glory, the Atari Jaguar. A machine that dared to be different, a console that claimed 64 bits when the world was still living in 16. A system that should have changed everything, but instead became a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of gaming history. This is not just a story about failure. It is a story about vision and hubris, about technology ahead of its time meeting a company behind the times, about brilliant engineers and misguided marketing, about a handful of incredible games lost in an ocean of mediocrity. The Jaguar's tale is one of what-ifs and almost weres, of a console that died too soon, leaving behind a legacy more fascinating than its 3-year life ever suggested. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through computing history, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps other curious minds find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, just breathe. Let the soft glow of the screen wash over you. Let your mind settle into the story, and drift with me into the strange, beautiful tragedy of the Atari Jaguar. Let's begin. In the early months of 1993, the gaming world stood at a crossroads. Nintendo's Super Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega's Genesis battled for supremacy in living rooms across the globe, their 16-bit architectures pushing sprite-based graphics to artistic heights. Magazine racks overflowed with coverage of Donkey Kong Country's pre-rendered graphics and Sonic's blazing speed. The console war was in full swing, and both companies seemed unassailable. But in the shadows, Atari Corporation was preparing something ambitious. Something that would leapfrog the entire 16-bit generation and plant a flag in the future. They called it the Jaguar, and they promised it would be nothing less than the world's first 64-bit gaming system. The marketing was bold, almost defiant. "Do the math," the advertisements proclaimed, suggesting that the Jaguar's 64 bits would demolish the competition's mere 16. The gaming landscape of 1993 was ripe for disruption. The 16-bit consoles, while impressive, were beginning to show their age. Gamers hungered for more polygons, smoother frame rates, and richer soundscapes. The promise of three-dimensional gaming loomed on the horizon like a distant shore. Companies experimented with add-ons and enhancements, the Sega CD and Super Nintendo's Mode 7 effects, offering glimpses of what might come next. Into this fertile ground, Atari planted the seeds of the Jaguar. The console arrived in test markets in New York City and San Francisco in November 1993, priced at $249.99. It came packaged with Cybermorph, a polygon-based space shooter that showcased the console's three-dimensional capabilities. The machine itself was sleek and black, with a distinctive cartridge slot, and an unusual controller featuring a numeric keypad borrowed from Atari's earlier designs. The gaming press approached with cautious curiosity. Here was Atari, a company whose name still carried weight, but whose recent history was marked by missteps and missed opportunities. The Atari 2600 had once ruled the early console market, defining what home gaming could be. The Atari ST computers had carved out a respectable niche in the late 1980s, but the Atari 7800 had languished as an also-ran, and the company's reputation among developers had suffered. Yet the Jaguar's specifications seemed impressive on paper. Multiple processors working in parallel, hardware support for three-dimensional graphics, CD-quality sound. The potential was undeniable. GameFan magazine named it the best new system of 1993. Early adopters who managed to secure one of the 17,000 units sold in the initial test market held the machine with something approaching reverence. This could be it, they thought. This could be Atari's comeback. The promise extended beyond mere hardware specifications. Atari spoke of peripherals that would expand the Jaguar's capabilities in exciting directions. A CD-ROM add-on would arrive, bringing full-motion video and a massive storage capacity. Online gaming through a voice modem would connect players across phone lines. A virtual reality headset would immerse gamers in three-dimensional worlds. Even an MPEG-2 video card was planned, turning the console into a multimedia entertainment center. These weren't just fever dreams scribbled on whiteboards. Prototypes existed. Demonstrations happened at trade shows. The vision was real, even if the execution would prove tragically difficult. The Jaguar represented Atari's bet that the future of gaming would belong to whoever could deliver the most powerful, most versatile system. They believed the math would work out in their favor. They believed 64 bits would be enough. To understand the Jaguar, we must first understand Atari's long, strange journey through the 1980s. The company that had birthed the video game industry with Pong and defined home gaming with the 2600 found itself battered by the market crash of 1983. Warner Communications, which had purchased Atari in 1976, grew weary of the losses and split the company. The arcade division went one way, becoming Atari Games. The home division was sold in 1984 to Jack Tramiel, the hard-nosed businessman who had built and then left Commodore. Tramiel's Atari Corporation focused on computers, releasing the Atari ST line that competed with the Commodore Amiga in the 16-bit personal computer market. The ST found success in certain markets, particularly in Europe where its MIDI capabilities made it popular among musicians. But the console business beckoned. In 1986, Atari released the 7800, a console compatible with the ancient 2600, but with improved graphics. It was too little, too late. Nintendo's NES had already captured American hearts and living rooms. By the end of the 1980s, Atari Corporation was adrift. Their ST computers faced extinction in the face of IBM-compatible PCs powered by Microsoft and Intel, the Wintel alliance that was beginning to dominate desktop computing. The 7800 had failed to make a significant dent in the console market. The Atari Lynx handheld, released in 1989 with impressive color graphics, struggled against Nintendo's Game Boy despite superior hardware. The company needed something revolutionary, something that could restore the Atari name to its former glory. Enter Flare Technology, a British design firm founded by Martin Brennan and John Mathieson. These engineers had worked on the ambitious Konix Multisystem, a never-released console that would have featured innovative peripherals and powerful graphics for its time. When the Konix project collapsed, Atari saw opportunity. They approached Flare with a proposal, designed two consoles, one to compete directly with the Genesis and Super Nintendo, and another to leapfrog them entirely. The first console was codenamed Panther, a 32-bit system intended to match or exceed the current generation. The second was Jaguar, conceived as a 64-bit powerhouse that would define the next generation. Atari persuaded Flare to close shop and reform as Flare 2, directly funded by Atari. The British engineers relocated to California and began work in earnest. They brought with them experience from the Konix project and a willingness to think outside conventional console architecture. Development progressed faster than anyone expected. The Jaguar's design coalesced quickly. with the team creating a multi-chip architecture that distributed processing tasks across specialized processors. By 1991, it became clear that the Jaguar was not only more promising than the Panther, but that it could be ready for market sooner. Atari made a crucial decision: cancel the Panther entirely and focus all resources on the Jaguar. It was a bold move, betting the company's future on a single console that would attempt to skip an entire generation. The engineering vision behind the Jaguar was elegant in theory. Rather than relying on a single powerful processor, the system would employ multiple specialized chips working in parallel. Each chip would handle specific tasks, operating simultaneously to achieve performance that would be difficult or expensive to reach with a single processor. This approach, sometimes called a multi-core design before that term became common, reflected both the team's creativity and the economic realities of console manufacturing. Cutting-edge single processors were expensive. Multiple cheaper processors working together could theoretically deliver similar or better results at lower cost. The architecture centered on two custom chips that the team nicknamed Tom and Jerry, playful references to the famous cartoon Cat and Mouse. Tom contained the graphics processing unit, the object processor, and the blitter, the trio of components that would handle visual output. Jerry housed the digital signal processor responsible for sound, along with various support functions. A standard Motorola 68000 processor, the same chip that powered the original Macintosh and the Sega Genesis, served as the system's manager, bootstrapping the console and coordinating the other processors. This multi-chip design would prove both the Jaguar's greatest strength and its most frustrating weakness. When programmed correctly, the console could deliver impressive results. When misunderstood or underutilized, it became a nightmare. But in the early 1990s, as the design took shape, the team believed they had created something special. Atari believed it too. The company poured resources into the project, desperate for the success that had eluded them for nearly a decade. By August 1993, the Jaguar was ready for its public debut. Atari unveiled it at the Chicago Consumer Entertainment Show to a mixture of excitement and skepticism. The specifications sounded impressive. The demonstration showed promise. But the gaming industry had learned to be cautious about Atari's pronouncements. Too many previous promises had dissolved into disappointment. The Jaguar would need to prove itself not with words but with games, with performance, with sales. The test market launch approached, and with it the moment of truth. The technical specifications of the Atari Jaguar read like a fever dream of early 1990s engineering ambition. At its heart, the console contained not one but 5 processors distributed across 3 chips, each with specific roles in the complex choreography of generating games. This was not a simple machine. Understanding the Jaguar requires understanding how these processors were meant to work together and why they so often didn't. Tom, the first custom chip, served as the graphics powerhouse. Built using a half-micron silicon process, this chip contained approximately 1.8 million transistors across its 196 pins. Inside, Tom lived 3 distinct processors that would handle the visual side of gaming. The graphics processing unit, or GPU, was a 32-bit RISC processor running at 26.59 MHz. It contained 4 kilobytes of internal cache and could execute 26.6 million instructions per second. This processor handled software-based graphics effects with additional instruction sets specifically designed for 3-dimensional operations. The object processor, also housed in Tom, was a 64-bit fixed-function video processor that converted display lists into actual video output at scan time. This component could write up to 2 pixels per clock cycle into the line buffer, supporting source data depths from 1 bit per pixel all the way up to 24 bits per pixel. Objects of different color resolutions could be mixed freely, with lower resolution objects using a palette to obtain 16-bit physical color. The sophistication of the object processor allowed it to modify existing line buffer contents, enabling transparency and other compositing effects. The third processor in TOM was the Blitter, a 64-bit high-speed logic operations unit with support for Z-buffering and Gouraud shading. The Blitter excelled at moving and filling graphical objects in memory, the fundamental operations behind sprite handling and polygon rendering. It included hardware support for 3-dimensional transformations, allowing programmers to offload complex mathematical operations from the other processors. The Blitter also managed the DRAM controller, providing 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit and 64-bit memory management across the console's 2 megabytes of fast page mode DRAM. Jerry, the second custom chip, matched TOM in manufacturing process but contained fewer transistors, approximately 900,000 across its 196 pins. The digital signal processor inside Jerry was another 32-bit RISC processor, also rated at 26.59 MHz, and capable of 53.3 million instructions per second. It shared the same RISC core as the GPU in TOM, but with a focus on audio operations rather than graphics. Jerry's DSP had access to 8 kilobytes of zero-weight state internal SRAM, significantly more than TOM's cache, making it better suited for sound generation. The audio capabilities were impressive on paper. The DSP could produce CD-quality sound at 16-bit stereo, 50 kHz sampling. The number of sound channels was limited only by software and processing power, with a minimum of 16 channels feasible. 2 digital-to-analog converters provided stereo output. The system supported wavetable synthesis, FM synthesis, FM sample synthesis, and amplitude modulation synthesis. Jerry also contained a clock control block with timers and a UART for serial communication. The Motorola 68000 processor, often dismissed as merely a manager, actually played a crucial role in the Jaguar's architecture. Running at 13.295 MHz, this 16/32-bit processor provided perfect 6800 emulation, making it familiar territory for developers who had worked on earlier Atari computers or the Sega Genesis. John Mathieson from Flare Technology explained that Atari insisted on including a 68000 family chip to give developers a comfortable starting point. The team had considered using a 68020 or even a 68030, but cost constraints led them to settle on the more affordable 68000. The Jaguar's memory architecture provided a 64-bit data path between the processors and the external DRAM, capable of 106.4 megabytes per second bandwidth. However, the 68000 could only access 16 bits of this bus at a time, creating a bottleneck when that processor needed to interact with memory. The console included 2 megabytes of main RAM on a 64-bit bus using 4 16-bit fast-page mode DRAM chips rated at 80 nanoseconds. Game cartridges could support up to 6 megabytes of uncompressed or compressed data. The video output capabilities were equally ambitious. The Jaguar could display 24-bit true color with 16,777,216 colors simultaneously. Multiple resolution and multiple color depth objects, from monochrome through 1-bit, 2-bit, 4-bit, 8-bit, 16-bit, and 24-bit, could coexist on screen. The maximum resolution reached 800 by 576 pixels, with even higher resolutions theoretically possible with additional hardware. The console supported both NTSC and PAL formats, providing S-video, composite and RGB outputs through an optional edge connector. The controversial 64-bit marketing claim centered on the fact that certain data paths and processors in the system operated at 64 bits wide. The object processor and blitter were true 64-bit components. The memory bus to DRAM operated at 64 bits. Atari's reasoning suggested that since Tom and Jerry's 32-bit processors worked in tandem through a 64-bit data path, the system qualified as 64-bit overall. This logic was met with skepticism and outright ridicule in the gaming press. Electronic Gaming Monthly published a mini-editorial mocking Atari's arithmetic, pointing out that if Sega did the math for the Sega Saturn the way Atari did the math for their 64-bit Jaguar system, the Sega Saturn would be a 112-bit monster of a machine. The controversy highlighted a fundamental problem. There was no agreed-upon standard for what constituted an N-bit system. Was it the width of the main processor, the data bus, the widest component, the sum of all components? Without clear definition, Atari's claims existed in a grey area between legitimate and misleading. Despite the controversy, some technical publications defended the Jaguar. Next Generation magazine, in a mostly negative review, maintained that it was indeed a true 64-bit system because of the 64-bit wide data path from DRAM to the processors. The debate underscored how the Jaguar's unconventional architecture defied easy classification. It wasn't a traditional console with a single processor driving everything. It was something different, something harder to explain, something that required nuance in an industry that preferred simple numbers. The controller that shipped with the Jaguar reflected Atari's history while attempting innovation. The pad featured an 8-directional joypad, 3 action buttons labelled A, B and C, plus pause and option buttons. The distinctive element was a 12-key numeric keypad on the controller's face, designed to accept game-specific overlays that could provide labelled context-sensitive controls. This design harked back to Atari's earlier consoles and computers, where overlays had added flexibility to limited button sets. In practice, most developers ignored the keypad, finding it awkward and unnecessary for most game types. The Jaguar was designed with expansion in mind. The cartridge slot doubled as a 32-bit expansion port. The digital signal processor port provided high-speed synchronous serial input and output. The console's expansion capabilities allowed for potential add-ons including keyboards, mice, light guns, and network connections. The 2 controller ports could theoretically support dozens of controllers through expansion. Comlink support enabled communication with the Atari Lynx handheld and networked multi-console games with up to 32 Jaguar units connected together. This hardware vision was simultaneously brilliant and problematic. The multi-processor architecture could deliver impressive performance when everything worked correctly. The 64-bit data paths could move graphics data efficiently. The dedicated processors for graphics, sound, and management could theoretically allow each to work at full capacity simultaneously. On paper, the Jaguar should have been capable of outperforming more expensive hardware. But paper specifications don't make great games. The complexity that made the Jaguar potentially powerful also made it difficult to program. The multiple processors needed to be carefully coordinated. The 68,000, while familiar, wasn't powerful enough to drive the console alone, meaning developers had to write code for the custom RISC processors to achieve good performance. The toolchain provided by Atari was incomplete and poorly documented. The multi-chip architecture that enabled cost-effective manufacturing created a development nightmare that would haunt the console throughout its short life. November 1993 arrived with anticipation and uncertainty. The Jaguar's test market launch in New York City and San Francisco represented Atari's carefully staged return to the console business. Rather than risk a nationwide release that could end in embarrassment if demand failed to materialize, or in disaster if demand exceeded manufacturing capacity, Atari chose to test the waters in two major metropolitan markets. The strategy made business sense, but it also signaled caution, perhaps even lack of confidence, in their own product. The launch marketing emphasized the console's technical superiority with the slogan "Get Bit by Jaguar," playing on the 64-bit claim while suggesting something wild and powerful. Advertisements positioned the console against the aging 16-bit competition, implying that the Genesis and Super Nintendo were yesterday's technology. The math was simple, Atari suggested. 64 is better than 16. The execution of that math, however, proved far more complicated than addition. Those 17,000 units sold in the test markets found their way into the hands of early adopters, the brave souls who always buy first-generation hardware. These gamers approached the Jaguar with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Some had fond memories of Atari's past glories and wanted to believe in a comeback. Others simply craved the cutting edge, the newest technology, the bragging rights that came with owning the most advanced console. They plugged in their Jaguars, loaded up Cybermorph, and discovered what 64 bits actually meant in practice. Cybermorph was Atari's chosen pack-in title, the game that would demonstrate the console's capabilities and justify its price tag. Developed by attention to detail, this polygonal space shooter put players in control of a transforming craft, navigating through three-dimensional environments, collecting items, and destroying enemy installations. The game showcased full three-dimensional graphics with texture-mapped polygons, something still relatively rare on home consoles in late 1993. Ships tumbled through space with convincing rotation. Planets loomed on horizons. The technology was clearly ahead of what the Super Nintendo or Genesis could achieve, but technology alone doesn't make a classic. Cybermorph suffered from design issues that prevented it from becoming the showcase Atari needed. The color palette skewed toward muddy greens and browns, making environments visually monotonous. The gameplay loop, while functional, lacked the polish and addictive quality of Nintendo or Sega's best work. Most infamously, the game featured a talkative AI companion named Skylar, who would constantly chide the player with phrases like, "Where did you learn to fly?" that quickly became grating. Reviews were mixed, praising the technical achievement while criticizing the execution. The comparison to Star Fox was inevitable and unflattering. Nintendo's Super Nintendo Space Shooter, released earlier in 1993, had used a custom Super FX chip to achieve polygonal graphics on 16-bit hardware. Star Fox featured tighter controls, more memorable characters, and a presentation that made technical limitations feel like artistic choices. Cybermorph, despite running on more powerful hardware, felt rougher, less refined, a proof of concept rather than a fully realized game. The Jaguar's technical advantages didn't automatically translate into better gaming experiences. The early game library did little to help Atari's cause. Trevor McFur in the Crescent Galaxy was a side-scrolling shooter that critics panned for generic gameplay and failure to showcase the console's abilities. Raiden, an arcade port, and Evolution, Dino Dudes, were criticized for being ordinary games on supposedly extraordinary hardware. These titles might have been acceptable on a Genesis or Super Nintendo, but on a console claiming to be the next generation, they felt inadequate. The Jaguar needed games that could only exist on its hardware, experiences that justified the 64-bit hype. The test market period also revealed practical problems. The controller, while functional, received complaints about the keypad's awkwardness and the overall ergonomics. The cartridge slot was finicky, requiring precise insertion. The console ran hot, its multiple processors generating heat that concerned some early adopters. The RF video output, the default connection method for most televisions of the era, didn't fully display the console's graphical capabilities. The Jaguar's promise and reality existed in uncomfortable tension. Despite these issues, Atari reported selling all 17,000 test market units, creating hope that broader demand existed. Game Fan magazine's Best New System award provided marketing ammunition. Some early reviews praised the console's potential while acknowledging its rough edges. In early 1994, 6 months after the test market launch, Atari expanded distribution nationwide. The price remained $249.99, positioning the Jaguar below the 3DO's $600 price point, but above the Super Nintendo and Genesis consoles that had dropped to more affordable levels. The nationwide rollout coincided with a crucial period in the console wars. The Super Nintendo and Genesis were mature platforms with extensive game libraries and strong developer support. The 3DO interactive multiplayer, despite its high price and questionable licensing model, had garnered significant media attention and promised a multimedia future. Sega was preparing the 32-bit Sega CD add-on, and rumors swirled about a new standalone console. Nintendo maintained its grip on younger audiences while appealing to older gamers with sophisticated titles. The window for the Jaguar to establish itself was narrowing. Computer Gaming Worlds. January 1994 assessment captured the challenge perfectly. The Jaguar was a great machine in search of a developer/customer base. The magazine noted that Atari had to overcome the stigma of its name, referring to the company's history of poor marketing, inadequate customer support, and difficult developer relations. Atari had ventured late into third-party software support, and now faced competition from the 3DO's 18-month public relations blitz that had resulted in an avalanche of software support. The Jaguar had hardware, but hardware wasn't enough. By the end of 1994, Atari reported approximately 100,000 units sold. This was not the breakthrough success they needed. For comparison, the Sega CD, generally considered a disappointment, had sold about 2.24 million units worldwide by this point. The 3DO, despite its high price and limited library, was tracking similarly to the Jaguar. The Super Nintendo and Genesis continued to dominate, each with installed bases in the tens of millions. The Jaguar was present in the market but barely visible. The small installed base created a vicious cycle. Retailers were hesitant to dedicate shelf space to a struggling console. Gamers were reluctant to invest in a system with few games and uncertain future. Developers couldn't justify the time and cost of creating Jaguar versions when the potential audience numbered in the thousands rather than millions. Each problem reinforced the others, creating a downward spiral that Atari lacked the resources to reverse. The company needed a breakthrough, a killer app that would justify the hardware and attract the audience. They needed their killer app to arrive before the competition crushed them. What they got was something quite different. The early adopters who had believed in the Jaguar found themselves in a familiar position for Atari fans, defending their purchase while hoping for better days ahead. Online forums and early internet communities hosted passionate debates about the console's merits and flaws. Some users achieved impressive results by programming directly for the RISC processors, creating demos that showcased what the hardware could do in skilled hands. But demos don't sell consoles. Games do. And in 1994, the Jaguar desperately needed games that would justify its 64-bit promise. If the Jaguar's library could be summarized in a single title, it would be Tempest 2000. Released in April 1994, this Jeff Minter masterpiece represented everything the console should have been. Technically impressive, creatively bold, and impossible to imagine on lesser hardware. Tempest 2000 was a remake of Dave Thurer's 1981 arcade classic Tempest, updated with polygonal graphics, pounding techno soundtrack, and psychedelic visual effects that made the original seem quaint by comparison. Jeff Minter, the eccentric British programmer behind Llamasoft, had attended an Atari developer conference where the company listed arcade games they wanted converted to the Jaguar. When Tempest came up, Minter immediately volunteered, as it was one of his favourite games. At the Jaguar's New York launch party, the creator of the console took Minter aside and expressed disappointment, feeling that Tempest 2000 was a poor demonstration of the hardware's capabilities. The criticism could have crushed a lesser developer. Minter pressed on, continuing development in Wales while learning to exploit the Jaguar's unusual architecture. The final product vindicated Minter's vision. Tempest 2000 combined vector-style wireframe rendering for the tubular webs with filled polygonal effects for enemies and power-ups. The game ran at a smooth 60 frames per second even during the most chaotic moments. The music, composed by Ian Howe, Alistair Lindsay, Kevin Saville and Julian Hodgson of Imagitech Design, pulsed with techno energy that perfectly matched the on-screen action. Tracks like Control and Minimum became iconic, capturing the mid-1990s electronic music aesthetic while pushing the Jaguar's audio capabilities. The visual effects were equally stunning. Meltovision transitions liquefied the screen between levels, creating swirling psychedelic patterns. The pixel shatter effect exploded scores across the display in cascades of coloured fragments. Background visualizers pulsed and shifted in time with the music, creating an almost synesthetic experience. Some players complained that the effects made it hard to see the gameplay, but for most, the sensory overload was the point. Tempest 2000 was a game that assaulted your senses and left you exhilarated. The game featured multiple modes that extended its longevity. Traditional Tempest recreated the original arcade game. Tempest Plus mixed elements of the classic and modern versions. Tempest Duel provided two-player competitive matches with exclusive power-ups like the mirror, which deflected opponent shots. The main Tempest 2000 mode progressed through increasingly complex web geometries and enemy patterns, with occasional bonus levels and warp zones that altered gameplay. The difficulty curve was steep but fair, rewarding practice and pattern recognition. Critics widely praised Tempest 2000, with many calling it the Jaguar's killer app. It demonstrated what the hardware could achieve in the hands of a talented developer who understood its architecture. Minter had written in assembly language, coding directly for the Tom and Jerry chips to extract maximum performance. He later remarked that the Jaguar hardware was actually easy to develop for, contradicting the prevailing wisdom. His experience suggested that the problem wasn't the hardware itself, but the documentation and tool chain that Atari provided to developers. The one significant criticism concerned the lack of a rotary controller. The original Tempest arcade machine used a distinctive spinner that allowed players to quickly rotate their ship, around the web's circumference. The Jaguar controller's directional pad, while functional, couldn't match the precision and speed of a rotary input. Interestingly, Tempest 2000 included hidden support for rotary controllers. By holding pause on both controllers simultaneously in the options menu, players could activate rotary mode. Atari had planned to manufacture rotary controllers for the Jaguar but ultimately cancelled them. Dedicated fans later created homebrew rotary solutions using parts from Atari 2600 driving controllers, or custom rotary encoders. Alien vs. Predator, released in October 1994 by Rebellion Developments, became the Jaguar's best-selling game, with 52,223 copies sold by April 1995. This first-person shooter took advantage of the license's built-in audience and the Jaguar's ability to render textured polygon environments at smooth frame rates. Players could choose between 3 species: alien, predator, or marine, each with distinct gameplay styles, weapons, and perspectives. The atmosphere was oppressive and tense, with dark corridors, motion sensors, and enemies that could attack from any direction, including above and below. Alien vs. Predator succeeded by understanding its platform. The developers built custom tools to optimize performance, ensuring smooth gameplay even in complex environments. The game featured full-screen action without borders or status bars cluttering the view. The sound design, with its screeches, roars, and industrial ambience, created genuine tension. The motion tracker's beep, beep, beep as enemies approached became a source of dread. Playing as the alien, with its ability to see through walls and climb surfaces, offered an entirely different experience than the Predator's cloaking and vision modes, or the Marine's arsenal of familiar weapons. The game wasn't perfect. The graphics, while impressive for the Jaguar, were sparse and sometimes repetitive. The level design could be confusing, with similar-looking corridors creating navigation challenges. The difficulty was punishing, especially for players unfamiliar with first-person shooters. But Alien vs. Predator captured something essential about the license and demonstrated that the Jaguar could deliver compelling experiences in the increasingly popular first-person genre. It stood alongside Doom, which also received a Jaguar port, as proof that the console could handle the type of games that were beginning to define the mid-1990s. Rayman, developed by Ubisoft and released in September 1995, arrived late in the Jaguar's life, but became one of its most polished and charming titles. This two-dimensional platformer featured hand-drawn animation, vibrant colours, and creative level design that felt both familiar and fresh. The titular character, a limbless hero with floating hands and feet, navigated through imaginative worlds filled with enemies, obstacles, and secrets. The game's visual style, created by artist Michel Ancel, looked distinctive and appealing, more akin to a Saturday morning cartoon than typical video game graphics. What made the Jaguar version significant was timing. Rayman was the last officially licensed game released for the console in Europe, arriving after Atari had essentially abandoned the platform. The game was also being developed for the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn, where it would reach much larger audiences and become a successful franchise. The Jaguar version was excellent, arguably the best two-dimensional platformer on the console, but it arrived too late to save the system. It stood as a bittersweet reminder of what could have been if more developers had invested in creating quality Jaguar software. Other notable games filled specific niches in the library. Doom, ported by id Software's John Carmack, ran impressively on the Jaguar, featuring larger play windows and smoother performance than many console competitors. The port used the network capabilities for deathmatch play over the Catbox networking adapter. Iron Soldier, a first-person mech combat game, offered large-scale destruction, with the player piloting a giant robot through cities and battlefields. Defender 2000, another Jeff Minter creation, updated the Williams classic with similar psychedelic flair to Tempest 2000. Missile Command 3D brought the Atari classic into 3 dimensions with trackball support. The library also included curious experiments and oddities. Kasumi Ninja attempted to compete with Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter II, but suffered from stiff animation and poor game balance. Club Drive was an ambitious attempt at a 3-dimensional driving game that ended up more tech demo than enjoyable experience. Trevor McFur in the Crescent Galaxy, an early launch title, was notable mainly for being forgettable. Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, a fighting game based on the biopic film, offered competent but unremarkable gameplay. These games filled store shelves, but rarely justified purchasing the console. The total official library for the Jaguar comprises 50 cartridge games and 13 CD-ROM titles. This pales in comparison to the hundreds of games available for the Super Nintendo and Genesis, or the thousands eventually released for the PlayStation. The small library meant that Jaguar owners played the same games repeatedly, memorizing every level, exhausting every secret. Forums and magazines featured extensive coverage of games that might have been footnotes on other platforms, simply because Jaguar owners were starved for content. What's remarkable about the Jaguar's best games is how they demonstrated the console's potential when given proper development time and skilled programming. Tempest 2000, Alien vs. Predator, and Rayman proved that the hardware could deliver experiences that matched or exceeded what the 16-bit consoles offered, and in some cases approached what the incoming 32-bit systems would achieve. The problem was that these experiences were rare exceptions rather than the rule. For every polished title, there were multiple mediocre ports or rushed releases that failed to leverage the hardware. The hidden gems and forgotten titles told their own stories. Atari Karts, a Mario Kart clone, was surprisingly competent given the genre's technical demands. iWar, a multiplayer-focused game, showcased the Catbox networking capabilities. Battlesphere, completed years after the console's discontinuation and released as a homebrew title in 2000, demonstrated what dedicated developers could achieve with the hardware. These games existed in the shadows, known mainly to hardcore collectors and enthusiasts who continued to explore the library long after Atari had moved on. Looking at the Jaguar's game library as a whole reveals a console caught between generations. Many games, particularly early releases, felt like slightly improved versions of 16-bit titles, not the generational leap that the 64-bit marketing promised. Other games attempted to compete with the emerging 32-bit platforms, but lacked the resources and time to match their polish. The best games transcended these limitations, offering unique experiences that couldn't be found elsewhere. But the best games were too few, too far between, and too late to change the Jaguar's trajectory. The year 1995 arrived like a storm on the horizon. For Atari and the Jaguar, it would be the year when hope died, and reality asserted itself with brutal clarity. The competition that Atari had attempted to leapfrog didn't simply vanish. Instead, 2 new predators entered the console ecosystem, machines backed by companies with resources and expertise that dwarfed anything Atari could muster. The Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn were coming, and they would reshape the gaming landscape entirely. Sony's entry into the gaming market had seemed unlikely just a few years earlier. The electronics giant was known for televisions, stereos, and the Walkman, not video games. But a failed partnership with Nintendo over a CD-ROM add-on had left Sony with technology and talent but no platform. Rather than abandon their investment, Sony decided to create their own console. They assembled a team that understood both hardware and software, poached key engineers from the industry, and most importantly, courted third-party developers with aggressive terms and support that made the PlayStation attractive to work on. The PlayStation launched in Japan in December 1994 and arrived in North America in September 1995 with a price of $299. The specs were impressive. A 32-bit MIPS A3000A processor, running at 33.8688 MHz, 2 MB of RAM, 1 MB of video RAM, and a CD-ROM drive capable of double-speed reading. The CD format gave games massive storage capacity, allowing for full-motion video, CD-quality audio, and game worlds far larger than cartridges could accommodate. Sony didn't claim to be 64-bit. They didn't need to. The games spoke for themselves. The launch lineup for the PlayStation was carefully curated to appeal to diverse audiences. Ridge Racer showcased smooth polygon racing with texture-mapped tracks. Battle Arena Toshinden demonstrated three-dimensional fighting. Wipeout offered futuristic anti-gravity racing with an electronic soundtrack that captured the zeitgeist. Resident Evil would arrive the following year, defining the survival horror genre. Final Fantasy VII would eventually cement the PlayStation as the home for Japanese role-playing games. The library grew rapidly, with third-party developers flocking to Sony's developer-friendly terms and massive marketing budget. Sony's marketing was relentless and sophisticated. They positioned the PlayStation not as a toy for children, but as entertainment for young adults. The You Are Not E campaign in the UK and edgy, often surreal advertisements in the US, created an identity that felt cool and modern. Sony courted the club scene, placed PlayStations in trendy bars, and associated their console with a lifestyle rather than just games. They built relationships with retail chains, ensuring prominent placement and knowledgeable staff. They created demo discs that showed off multiple games, distributed through magazines and in stores, giving potential customers extensive hands-on experience. The Sega Saturn followed a more troubled path to market. Originally designed as a two-dimensional powerhouse with impressive sprite scaling capabilities, the console was hastily redesigned when Sony's plans became clear. Sega added a second SH2 processor to improve three-dimensional performance, creating an architecture even more complex than the Jaguars. The Saturn launched in Japan in November 1994 to strong sales, but the North American launch in May 1995 became infamous for its bungled execution. At the first Electronic Entertainment Expo in May 1995, Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske announced that the Saturn was available immediately at select retailers for $399. This surprise launch was meant to give Sega a head start over Sony, but it backfired spectacularly. Many retailers, angry at being excluded from the launch, refused to stock the Saturn. The limited availability meant only a few games shipped with the console. Developers who had been planning launch titles found their schedules disrupted. When Sony's Steve Race took the stage later that same day and simply said $299, then walked off to thunderous applause, the Saturn's fate was essentially sealed before its real launch in September. Despite these problems, the Saturn had significant strengths. In Japan, where Sega's relationships with developers ran deep, the console thrived with excellent arcade ports and exclusive titles. Games like Virtua Fighter, Panzer Dragoon, and Nights into Dreams showcased what the hardware could achieve. The Saturn's two-dimensional capabilities made it the best platform for fighting games and shooters. But in North America, the botched launch, high price, and subsequent poor sales created a spiral similar to the Jaguar's, only on a larger scale. Developers focused on the PlayStation's larger installed base, leaving the Saturn with a library that, while quality in specific genres couldn't match Sony's breadth. For the Jaguar, the arrival of these 32-bit consoles was catastrophic. Suddenly, there were two new consoles backed by major corporations with marketing budgets that made Atari's efforts look amateur. Both systems had CD-ROM drives, offering clear advantages in storage and audio quality. Both had strong launch lineups and promised extensive third-party support. Both were priced competitively, with Sony undercutting everyone at $299. The PlayStation was $100 more than the Super Nintendo but delivered next-generation experiences. The Jaguar, also priced around $250 after a cut, now looked outdated despite its 64-bit claims. Nintendo, meanwhile, continued to dominate with the Super Nintendo while planning their response to Sony and Sega. The company had announced Project Reality, later renamed Nintendo 64, in partnership with Silicon Graphics. The console would use cartridges instead of CDs, a controversial decision that would cost them third-party support but maintain Nintendo's preference for fast load times and difficulty of piracy. Scheduled for 1996, the Nintendo 64 would be a true 64-bit console, using a single powerful MIPS R4300i processor rather than Atari's multi-chip approach. The announcement created anticipation and made the Jaguar's 64-bit claims seem premature. The so-called bit wars of the mid-1990s created confusion and hype in equal measure. Marketing departments threw around numbers 32-bit, 64-bit, sometimes even 128-bit for the Saturn's dual processors, without clear standards for what these numbers meant. Consumers, understandably confused, latched onto simpler factors: game library, price, brand recognition, and what their friends owned. In this environment, Atari's 64-bit marketing became less an advantage and more a source of skepticism. When everyone claimed to be the most powerful, the actual games and experiences determined winners. The timing of the PlayStation and Saturn launches couldn't have been worse for Atari. The Jaguar had barely established itself in 1994, selling only 100,000 units. The console desperately needed 1995 to build momentum, attract developers, and convince consumers that it represented the future. Instead, 1995 brought new competition that made the Jaguar seem like a transitional device, neither fish nor fowl, not truly next generation, but also not part of the established 16-bit ecosystem. Caught between generations, the Jaguar found itself with no clear identity in an increasingly crowded market. Retail shelf space became a battleground. With limited space to display consoles and games, retailers had to make choices. The Super Nintendo and Genesis, with massive installed bases and reliable sales, kept their prominent positions. The PlayStation and Saturn, backed by Sony and Sega's marketing and the promise of hot new releases, secured prime real estate. The 3DO, despite its struggles, had Trip Hawkins' reputation and Panasonic's support. The Jaguar, increasingly, was relegated to corners and clearance bins. Some stores stopped carrying it entirely, citing poor sales and lack of customer interest. The gaming press, which had given the Jaguar cautious coverage and occasional praise, began writing obituaries. Articles in Electronic Gaming Monthly, GamePro, and Next Generation questioned whether Atari could survive. Reviews of new Jaguar games often included caveats about the console's uncertain future. Previews of upcoming titles were met with skepticism about whether they would actually release. The narrative shifted from the Jaguar might succeed to the Jaguar is doomed, but here's what went wrong. This coverage, while often accurate, created a self-fulfilling prophecy as negative perceptions discouraged potential customers. Atari's 1995 annual report laid bare the disaster unfolding. The company noted that Jaguar sales were substantially below Atari's expectations, and Atari's business and financial results were materially adversely affected in 1995 as Atari continued to invest heavily in Jaguar game development, entered into arrangements to publish certain licensed titles, and reduced the retail price for its Jaguar console unit. The report attributed the poor performance to extensive delays in development of software for the Jaguar, which resulted in reduced orders. The delays stemmed from the console's complex architecture and inadequate development tools, the very factors that had plagued the system since launch. By late 1995, the competition had moved from threat to reality to victory. The PlayStation was on track to dominate the generation, with sales exceeding 10 million units within its first year in North America alone. The Saturn, despite its stumbles, was carving out a loyal audience and would eventually sell 9.5 million units worldwide. Even the troubled 3DO, with its expensive hardware and questionable licensing model, had sold more units than the Jaguar. Atari's console, which had launched with such promise 2 years earlier, was dying in obscurity, a footnote in a battle it never had a chance of winning. In September 1995, Atari launched the Jaguar CD, an add-on peripheral that transformed the console into a CD-ROM system. Priced at $150, the device sat underneath the Jaguar, connecting through the cartridge slot and adding a CD drive capable of double-speed reading. The hardware included its own Motorola 68020 processor running at 26.59 MHz, additional RAM, and the Butchie chip for MPEG decompression. On paper, the Jaguar CD addressed one of the console's most significant weaknesses: limited storage capacity and the inability to compete with the CD-based systems flooding the market. The peripheral came bundled with a demo disc and, in some regions, with the Tempest 2000 soundtrack, showcasing the console's virtual light machine music visualizer. This visualizer, programmed by Jeff Minter, created abstract animations synchronized to audio CD playback, turning the Jaguar into a psychedelic light show generator. It was impressive technically and visually stunning, but it was hardly a system seller. Gamers wanted games, not visualizers, and the Jaguar CD's game library would prove painfully thin. Only 13 titles were officially released for the Jaguar CD during the console's commercial life. Some were interesting experiments that leveraged the CD format's advantages. Blue Lightning was a launch title that offered arcade-style dogfighting. Battlemorph, a sequel to Cybermorph, featured improved graphics and full-motion video cutscenes. Hoverstrike was a combat flight simulator with large open environments. Myst, the hugely popular PC adventure game, appeared on Jaguar CD with a port that showcased the system's ability to handle pre-rendered graphics and atmospheric sound. Primal Rage was a fighting game featuring stop-motion dinosaurs. Other releases felt desperate or misguided. VidGrid was a full-motion video puzzle game that relied heavily on music videos, a concept that seemed dated even in 1995. Baldi's was a real-time strategy game that struggled with the Jaguar controller's limitations. Braindead 13 was an interactive movie game in the vein of Dragon's Lair, featuring cartoon graphics and quick-time events. These games, while diverse, couldn't overcome the fundamental problem. The Jaguar CD arrived too late, cost too much as an add-on to an already struggling console, and competed directly with the PlayStation and Saturn, which had CD-ROMs built in and cost the same as buying a Jaguar and the CD unit combined. The hardware itself had reliability issues. The tray loading mechanism proved fragile, prone to skipping and eventual failure. Some units shipped with faulty parts that limited compatibility with certain games. The additional processor and RAM should have made the Jaguar CD significantly more powerful than the base console, but few developers took full advantage of the capabilities. Most games treated it simply as a storage medium, using the CD for audio and video but not fundamentally changing gameplay. The potential was there, but like so much of the Jaguar story, execution fell short of ambition. Atari attempted other peripherals to extend the console's life and appeal. The JagLink system allowed two Jaguars to be connected for head-to-head multiplayer in supported games like Doom and Battlemorph. While an interesting feature, it required players to own two consoles, two copies of the game, two televisions, and the linking cables. The real-world audience for this setup was vanishingly small. The memory track cartridge provided save game storage, addressing a need but arriving late and supporting few titles. These accessories felt more like afterthoughts than essential components of a cohesive platform. The promised peripherals that never materialized haunted the Jaguar's legacy. The Jaguar voice modem, intended to enable online gaming through dial-up connections, was announced but never released. Prototypes existed, and some games included code to support it, but Atari lacked the resources to bring it to market and establish the necessary online infrastructure. The technology was ahead of its time, predating mainstream console online gaming by years, but vision without execution is just daydreaming. The Jaguar VR headset represented perhaps the most ambitious and tragic what-if of the console's peripheral roadmap. In 1994, Atari partnered with Virtuality, a company known for arcade VR systems, to develop a virtual reality headset for the Jaguar. Prototypes were built and demonstrated at trade shows, promising 360-degree head tracking and stereoscopic visuals. The technology was wildly ahead of its time, predating the Oculus Rift by nearly 20 years. But Atari's mounting financial problems killed the project before it could reach production. The headset became a tantalizing glimpse of a future that never arrived, a symbol of the console's unfulfilled potential. In early 1995, Atari dropped the Jaguar's price to $149.99, trying to position it as the low-cost next-generation console. The strategy made sense in theory, undercutting the 3DO's $600, the Saturn's $399, and matching the PlayStation's $299 while being technically more advanced, at least according to Atari's marketing. Infomercials featuring enthusiastic salesmen touted the console's value proposition, with the slogan "Do the Math," taking on new meaning as a price comparison rather than just technical specification. The price cut and marketing blitz failed to move significant inventory. The fundamental problem remained. The Jaguar lacked compelling games and faced competition from consoles with robust libraries, aggressive marketing, and strong third-party support. Being cheaper didn't matter if the console couldn't deliver the experiences gamers wanted. The price cut also signaled desperation to industry observers. When a console this young receives such aggressive discounting, it suggests that the platform holder has given up on premium positioning and is simply trying to clear warehouse stock. Atari's relationships with developers, never strong, deteriorated further as the console's sales disappointed. Third-party publishers who had committed to Jaguar development found themselves releasing games to an audience of tens of thousands rather than millions. The economics didn't work. The development challenges, poor documentation, and Atari's limited support made creating Jaguar games more difficult than developing for other platforms. Some developers who had announced titles quietly cancelled them. Others released compromise versions that didn't showcase the console's capabilities. The few who persevered and created quality software found their efforts unrewarded by sales. Failed partnerships and missed opportunities littered the Jaguar's history. Atari tried to secure major franchises and developers, but lacked the financial leverage to make competitive offers. Companies like Capcom, Square, and Konami, whose support could have legitimized the platform, stayed away or offered only token releases. The absence of key franchises, Street Fighter, Final Fantasy, Metal Gear, left gaps in the library that could never be filled by first-party or smaller third-party efforts. Each missing franchise made the console less attractive to its target audience. By the end of 1995, Atari had essentially given up on the Jaguar. The company's focus shifted to survival rather than growth. Rumors circulated about potential buyers, mergers, or liquidation. The console continued to exist in retail channels, but new game releases slowed to a trickle. The Jaguar CD, launched with such hope just months earlier, was already being discounted. Store displays were dismantled, shelf space reallocated to the PlayStation and Saturn. The Jaguar's brief moment in the spotlight had passed, and what came next would be a slow, undignified exit from the market it had tried so hard to capture. The desperation moves, price cuts, peripherals, marketing campaigns, all shared a common thread: too little, too late. Each initiative might have made a difference if implemented earlier, as part of a cohesive strategy backed by adequate resources and strong software. But Atari was always reacting rather than leading, always one step behind the competition, always hoping that the next move would turn things around. In business, especially in the fast-moving console market, hope is not a strategy. The Jaguar needed more than hope. It needed time, money, and games. It had none of them in sufficient quantity. To understand why the Jaguar struggled despite its impressive specifications, one must understand what it was like to actually develop games for the system. On the surface, the multiprocessor architecture seemed elegant. In practice, it was a developer's nightmare. The documentation provided by Atari was incomplete, poorly written, and sometimes simply wrong. The development tools were primitive compared to what Sony and Sega offered their developers. The architecture itself, while powerful in theory, required a level of low-level programming expertise that many studios simply didn't have or couldn't justify investing in for such a small market. The fundamental challenge was getting all 5 processors to work together efficiently. The Motorola 68000, while familiar to developers who had worked on Genesis or Atari ST, wasn't powerful enough to drive the console alone. To achieve good performance, developers needed to write code for the Tom and Jerry RISC processors. But these processors had small amounts of cache, 4 kilobytes for the GPU and 8 kilobytes for the DSP, meaning code needed to be extremely tight and optimized. Any overflow to main RAM would incur performance penalties that could tank frame rates. The 64-bit data paths touted in marketing created their own challenges. While the object processor and blitter could handle 64-bit operations, programming for them required understanding their unique instruction sets and timing requirements. The memory architecture, with its different access widths and speeds depending on which processor was reading or writing, created bottlenecks that weren't immediately obvious. Code that ran fine in a simple test could collapse under the complexity of a full game when all processors competed for memory access. Atari's official development kit was infamously inadequate. The assembler and linker tools were closed source and generated output in the outdated A.out format. The C compiler was based on the GCC toolchain, but poorly adapted for the Jaguar's architecture, often producing inefficient code that failed to leverage the custom processors. Debugging tools were rudimentary at best. Developers often resorted to print statements and visual indicators to track down bugs, a primitive approach for a supposedly next-generation console released in the mid-1990s. Third-party tools eventually emerged to fill the gaps. Cross-products offered the SNASM development system, a comprehensive package including multi-window debuggers, assemblers, compilers, and SCSI support for approximately $3,700. This was a significant investment for studios considering Jaguar development, especially given the console's uncertain market position. The SNASM system allowed full-screen, source-level debugging of multiple processors simultaneously in C or assembler, capabilities that should have been included in Atari's official toolkit. That developers needed to purchase expensive third-party solutions to create games effectively highlighted Atari's failure to support their own platform. The multi-chip architecture also created challenges for balancing workload. In theory, developers could assign graphics to Tom's GPU, sound to Jerry's DSP, game logic to the 68000, and achieve impressive parallel processing. In practice, determining the optimal distribution of tasks required deep understanding of each processor's strengths, limitations, and how they interacted. An inefficient distribution could leave some processors idle, while others were overwhelmed, negating the advantages of the multi-chip design. Few developers had the time or resources to optimize thoroughly, resulting in games that used the 68000 for most tasks and treated the RISC processors as barely utilized support chips. Jeff Minter's success with Tempest 2000 and Defender 2000 demonstrated what was possible with skilled optimization. Minter wrote directly in assembly language, coding for the RISC processors and carefully managing memory access patterns. He understood the hardware intimately, having spent months learning its quirks and capabilities. His experience suggested that the Jaguar wasn't fundamentally broken, it was simply misunderstood and poorly supported. But expecting every developer to have Minter's skill level and dedication was unrealistic. Most studios needed better tools and documentation to create quality software on reasonable timelines. The documentation problems extended beyond mere incompleteness. Some technical manuals contradicted each other. Timing information for certain operations was incorrect, leading developers to write code that should have worked according to the docs but failed on actual hardware. Memory maps sometimes listed wrong addresses. The object processor's display list format was poorly explained, requiring developers to reverse engineer examples to understand how it actually worked. These issues weren't just annoying, they were time sinks that made Jaguar development significantly more expensive than developing for better documented platforms. Fabien Sanglard, who ported Another World to the Jaguar years later as a technical challenge, documented his experience in detailed blog posts. He described the Tom chip as a beast to figure out, with complex interactions between its various processors. Even with the benefit of public source code from games like Tempest 2000, understanding how to efficiently use the hardware required significant effort. Sanglard noted that combining data updated together into single storage operations was critical for performance, as sequential storage calls could create bottlenecks. The need for such low-level optimization discouraged developers who were used to more forgiving architectures. Developer relations at Atari were another weak point. The company had limited resources to provide hands-on support answer technical questions, or help debug problematic code. Response times to developer inquiries could stretch for weeks. Sample code, when available, was often outdated or incomplete. Atari's history of poor developer relations stemming from the 1980s created skepticism about whether the company would adequately support its platform. Studios considering Jaguar development had to weigh not just the technical challenges, but also the risk that Atari might abandon the console or fail to provide necessary assistance. The small installed base compounded these development challenges. Even if a studio mastered the Jaguar's architecture and created an excellent game, the potential audience numbered in the hundreds of thousands at best. For context, developing a game required months of work from teams of programmers, artists, sound designers, and testers. The investment could easily reach hundreds of thousands of dollars. To recoup those costs and make profit, the game needed to sell tens of thousands of copies at minimum. With the Jaguar's total sales barely exceeding 250,000 units by 1996, and many of those owners purchasing only a handful of games, the economics simply didn't work for most developers. Third-party exodus accelerated through 1995. Companies that had announced Jaguar titles quietly cancelled them or shifted focus to PlayStation and Saturn. The list of developers who had committed support in the console's early days — Ocean, Microprose, Activision, Williams, Interplay and others — gradually walked away as it became clear the platform wouldn't achieve commercial viability. By late 1995, new Jaguar announcements had essentially stopped. The few games still in development were either contractual obligations or passion projects by developers who had sunk too much time to abandon the platform entirely. Stories from developers who attempted Jaguar ports illustrated the challenges. Programmers accustomed to the Genesis's straightforward architecture, where the Motorola 68000 handled most tasks with support from dedicated graphics and sound chips, found the Jaguar's distributed processing model confusing. Those coming from the Super Nintendo, with its well-documented coprocessors and excellent dev tools, were frustrated by the Jaguar's poor documentation and primitive tool chain. Even developers with Atari ST experience, who should have had advantages due to the 68000's presence, struggled with the unfamiliar RISC processors and the complex memory architecture. The developer's nightmare extended to testing and bug fixing. With multiple processors executing code simultaneously, race conditions and timing bugs were common and difficult to diagnose. A game might run perfectly for hours, then crash inexplicably due to subtle interaction between processors accessing memory at the same moment. Reproducing bugs could be maddeningly difficult. The limited debugging tools meant that tracking down the source of crashes often required informed guessing and trial and error rather than systematic analysis. This made the final phases of development, when polish and stability should be the focus, into extended bug hunts that delayed releases and increased costs. The beginning of 1996 marked not a fresh start for the Jaguar, but the beginning of the end. Atari Corporation's financial situation had become dire. The company reported massive losses for 1995, with the Jaguar accounting for much of the red ink. The console had failed to gain meaningful market share, selling approximately 150,000 units in North America and perhaps another 100,000 worldwide. For perspective, the PlayStation had sold over 20 million units in its first year globally. The gap wasn't just large, it was insurmountable. Retail support evaporated through the first quarter of 1996. Major chains that had given the Jaguar shelf space in 1994 and 1995 now removed the console entirely or relegated it to clearance sections. EB Games, Toys R Us, and other major retailers reported weak sales and customer disinterest. Some stores offered aggressive discounts, selling bundled Jaguar systems with multiple games for under $100, prices that suggested liquidation rather than active selling. The sight of deeply discounted Jaguars, rather than attracting bargain hunters, reinforced the perception that the console was dead. Game releases in 1996 slowed to a trickle. Brett Hull Hockey, released in January, was one of the last official cartridge games. Fight for Life, François Bertrand's ambitious fighting game, shipped in March after years of development that had begun before the console even launched. The game featured unique three-dimensional grappling mechanics and detailed character models, but it arrived far too late to matter. Reviewers noted its technical achievements while acknowledging that the Jaguar's fate was already sealed. The handful of other releases, mostly ports or projects too far along to cancel, shipped to an audience that had already moved on. The Jaguar CD fared even worse. After the initial batch of releases in late 1995, new titles became extremely rare. World Tour Racing arrived in 1996 with full-motion video and expansive tracks, showcasing what the CD add-on could theoretically deliver, but finding one in stores was nearly impossible. Robinson's Requiem, a survival adventure game, received extremely limited distribution. These games, regardless of quality, couldn't find an audience because the audience no longer existed. Retailers had stopped ordering Jaguar CD units, and consumers saw no reason to invest in a peripheral for a dead console. Atari's corporate troubles deepened. Sam Tramiel, son of company owner Jack Tramiel and the driving force behind the Jaguar, faced increasing pressure from board members and investors. The company had bet heavily on the console and lost. The losses extended beyond just the Jaguar hardware. Development costs for first-party and funded titles, marketing expenses, inventory write-downs, and support for peripherals that never sold, all accumulated into a financial disaster. Atari Corporation needed a lifeline, and in mid-1996 they thought they found one. In July 1996, Atari Corporation merged with JTS Inc., a struggling hard drive manufacturer. The merger was essentially JTS acquiring Atari, with Atari shareholders receiving 0.097 shares of JTS common stock for each Atari share. The term suggested desperation rather than strategic partnership. JTS had no experience in consumer electronics or gaming, and their interest in Atari seemed more about acquiring any assets that might have value rather than continuing the company's legacy. The writing was on the wall. Atari Corporation as an independent entity was finished. The Jaguar was officially discontinued following the merger. JTS showed zero interest in continuing console production or supporting the platform. Remaining inventory was sold off, often at fire sale prices. Development of new games stopped. The few titles still in production at outside studios were either cancelled or, in rare cases, completed and released through alternative channels years later as collectibles. The console that had launched with such promise in November 1993 was dead by summer 1996, a lifespan of less than 3 years. The post-mortem analysis from gaming media was swift and harsh. Electronic Gaming Monthly ran features discussing what went wrong, citing the weak launch lineup, poor third-party support, confusing marketing, and ultimately, competition from Sony and Sega that Atari simply couldn't match. Next Generation magazine's obituary noted that the Jaguar never managed to convince developers or gamers that it was worth investing in. GamePro's retrospective focused on the disconnect between technical specifications and actual gaming experiences, arguing that bits don't matter if the games aren't fun. These assessments, while accurate, felt almost cruel in their finality. Final sales figures painted a bleak picture. Estimates suggest the Jaguar sold between 150,000 and 250,000 units in North America, and perhaps an additional 50,000 to 100,000 units internationally, for a total worldwide installed base of around 200,000 to 350,000 consoles. The Jaguar CD sold significantly fewer units, with estimates ranging from 10,000 to 20,000. For comparison, the PlayStation would go on to sell over 100 million units worldwide, the Nintendo 64 over 32 million, and even the Saturn, considered a failure in North America, would reach 9.5 million globally. The Jaguar's sales were rounding errors in the larger console market. The human cost of the Jaguar's failure extended beyond corporate balance sheets. Engineers who had poured years into designing the hardware watched their work disappear. Developers who had believed in the platform and created games for it found their efforts went largely unplayed. Atari employees who had dedicated themselves to the console's success lost their jobs when the merger happened. The Tramiel family, which had tried to revive Atari's fortunes, saw their company absorbed into an unrelated business. The enthusiastic early adopters who had supported the console found themselves with orphaned hardware. The broader implications for Atari's brand were devastating. The Jaguar's failure marked the end of Atari as a significant player in consumer electronics. The company name would change hands multiple times over the following decades, with various entities acquiring rights to use Atari for different purposes, but the Atari that had invented the video game industry, that had given the world Pong and the 2600, was gone. The Jaguar became the company's last gasp, a failed Hail Mary pass that fell incomplete and ended the game. Industry observers noted several lessons from the Jaguar's demise. First, technical specifications alone don't sell consoles, games do. The Jaguar's impressive hardware couldn't compensate for a weak game library. Second, developer support is critical. Sony's success with the PlayStation stemmed largely from their excellent relations with third parties, providing tools, support, and favourable terms. Atari's poor developer relations doomed the Jaguar from the start. Third, timing matters. Launching between console generations left the Jaguar in no man's land, too late to compete with established 16-bit consoles and too early to match the incoming 32-bit systems. Marketing alone couldn't overcome fundamental problems. Atari's Do the Math campaign might have been clever, but it couldn't make the 64-bit claims seem less dubious, or compensate for the lack of must-have software. The price drops, while making the console more affordable, signalled desperation that scared away rather than attracted consumers. The peripheral strategy, banking on the Jaguar CD to revitalise interest, failed because it required consumers to invest more money into a platform that was clearly struggling. Every move Atari made seemed to reinforce negative perceptions rather than reverse them. The Jaguar's death spiral serves as a case study in how multiple failures can compound. The complex hardware made development difficult, which discouraged third parties, which limited the game library, which reduced consumer interest, which made retailers reluctant to stock the console, which further discouraged developers, continuing the cycle. Each element reinforced the others, creating momentum toward failure that Atari lacked the resources to counter. Once the spiral began, probably in mid-1994 when third parties started backing away, the outcome was essentially predetermined. What's tragic is that none of the individual problems were necessarily fatal on their own. Complex hardware can be overcome with good tools and documentation, as Nintendo later demonstrated with the Nintendo 64's sophisticated architecture. Small launch libraries can be built up over time if the platform gains momentum. Weak marketing can be improved with better campaigns and positioning. But the Jaguar suffered from all these problems simultaneously, and Atari lacked the time, money, and expertise to fix any of them adequately. The console died not from a single wound, but from 1,000 cuts, each small failure bleeding away a bit more potential until nothing remained. By the end of 1996, the Jaguar existed primarily as a cautionary tale. Industry veterans pointed to it when discussing the importance of developer relations, the danger of overhyping technical specifications, and the challenge of entering the console market without massive resources. The console joined a long list of failed hardware, the 3DO, the CDI, the Sega 32X, systems that had promised revolution but delivered disappointment. The Jaguar's spot on that list was secure, its story told and retold as an example of ambition exceeding capability, of vision without execution, of a last hope that failed. The story could have ended there, with the Jaguar fading into obscurity, remembered only by those who had owned one, and by gaming historians documenting the console wars. But something unexpected happened in the years following the console's discontinuation. A small but dedicated community of enthusiasts refused to let the Jaguar die. They would breathe new life into the deceased console, creating a homebrew scene that continues even today, decades after Atari abandoned the platform. The seeds of the homebrew movement were planted by Atari itself, inadvertently. When JTS acquired Atari Corporation, they had no interest in the gaming division's intellectual property. In 1999, Hasbro Interactive purchased the rights to the Atari name and selected assets from JTS. As part of this transition, the technical specifications and development information for the Jaguar were released to the public domain, making it legal for anyone to create and distribute software for the console without licensing fees or legal concerns. This release transformed the Jaguar from an orphaned commercial platform into an open development system. Enthusiasts who had always been curious about the console's architecture now had official documentation to study. Programmers interested in low-level hardware development found in the Jaguar a challenging but rewarding target. The multi-chip architecture, so troublesome for commercial developers under time and budget constraints, became an intriguing puzzle for hobbyists working at their own pace for the love of the platform. Early homebrew efforts focused on understanding the hardware and creating simple demonstrations. Enthusiasts shared code snippets, documented undiscovered features, and corrected errors in the official documentation. Online communities formed around the Jaguar, with websites like Atari Age hosting forums where developers could collaborate, share knowledge, and showcase their work. The accumulated wisdom of both the original developers and the new homebrew community gradually made the Jaguar easier to work with than it had been during its commercial life. One of the first significant homebrew releases was Battlesphere, a game that had been in development during the Jaguar's commercial life, but wasn't completed until 2000. Created by Skaterlogic, a small team of dedicated developers, Battlesphere was an ambitious space combat simulator featuring three-dimensional graphics, complex gameplay mechanics, and support for the JagLink multiplayer system. The game was released in a limited physical run, complete with professional packaging and documentation. It demonstrated that quality software for the Jaguar was still possible years after the console's death. The homebrew scene gradually expanded. Protector, a horizontal shooter released in 2002, reimagined the classic arcade game Defender with modern graphics and gameplay enhancements. It became one of the most polished homebrew releases, with tight controls and impressive visual effects that showcased what skilled programmers could achieve with the Jaguar's hardware. Protector SE, an enhanced version, would follow in 2014, proving that development continued well into the 21st century. More ambitious projects emerged. Rebooteroids, released in 2004, was a remake of Asteroids with modern graphics and addictive gameplay. Encounter, released in 2012, featured impressive three-dimensional graphics and smooth gameplay that pushed the Jaguar's capabilities. T009, a 2016 release, combined creative visuals with engaging shooting mechanics. These games, created by individuals or small teams working in their spare time, often exceeded the quality of many commercial Jaguar releases, vindicating the hardware's potential while highlighting how poorly it had been supported during its original run. The homebrew community also tackled ports and original concepts that Atari and third parties had never attempted. Doom Resurrection, an enhanced version of the official Doom port with improved graphics and performance, showed what could be achieved with deeper understanding of the hardware. Alice's Mom's Rescue added new content to an existing game. Another World, ported by Fabien Sanglar, demonstrated the feasibility of bringing classic PC games to the console. Each release expanded the Jaguar's library, giving the console a second life it never had commercially. The tools available to homebrew developers improved significantly over time. While the original Atari development kit had been primitive, modern cross-development tools allowed programmers to write code on contemporary PCs and compile for the Jaguar. Emulators provided testing environments that were more convenient than using real hardware during development. Flash cartridges enabled easy testing and distribution of homebrew games, eliminating the need for expensive cartridge production for small runs. These improvements lowered the barrier to entry, allowing more developers to experiment with Jaguar programming. AtariAge became the central hub for the Jaguar homebrew community. The site hosted forums, archived documentation, and operated a store that sold both original games and homebrew releases. Albert Yarusso, AtariAge's founder, championed the Jaguar and other classic Atari systems, providing a space where enthusiasts could connect and collaborate. The site's Jaguar Game by Game podcast, running from 2005 to 2010, featured detailed discussions of every commercial and homebrew release, preserving knowledge and keeping interest alive. The community that coalesced around AtariAge ensured that the Jaguar would never be completely forgotten. Physical manufacturing of homebrew games created another dimension to the scene. While digital distribution through flash cartridges or emulation was convenient, collectors and enthusiasts wanted physical copies with packaging and manuals. Small production runs, often limited to hundreds of copies, were manufactured and sold through AtariAge and other specialty retailers. These releases featured professional quality labels, boxes, and documentation, treating homebrew software with the same respect as commercial products. The care taken in presentation reflected the community's love for the platform and desire to give the Jaguar the library it deserved. The Jaguar Game Drive, a flash cartridge device released in the 2010s, revolutionized how enthusiasts experienced homebrew games. The device, priced around $150, allowed users to load multiple games onto an SD card and play them on real hardware without needing individual cartridges. It made the entire homebrew library accessible, encouraged developers by making distribution trivial, and gave new Jaguar owners an instant collection of games to explore. The Game Drive represented the maturity of the homebrew scene, providing professional-grade tools that matched or exceeded what Atari had offered commercial developers. Some original Jaguar developers returned to the platform through the homebrew scene. They had moved on to other projects and platforms during their professional careers, but nostalgia and unfinished business drew them back. They contributed knowledge, shared source code from original games, and sometimes even created new content. Their participation validated the homebrew community and provided historical continuity, linking the console's commercial past with its hobbyist present. The collector market for Jaguar hardware and software exploded in the 2000s and 2010s as retro gaming became increasingly popular. Consoles that had sold for $50 or less in the late 1990s now commanded hundreds of dollars in good condition. Complete in-box systems with manuals and packaging became premium collectibles. Rare games, particularly those with limited release like the Jaguar CD titles, reached remarkable prices. The homebrew releases, especially early limited runs, also appreciated significantly. The Jaguar had failed commercially but succeeded as a collectible, achieving value in death it never had in life. The modern Jaguar scene is small but vibrant. New games continue to release, with titles like Xenon 2019 Plus and Super Burnout arriving in recent years. Online communities remain active, discussing everything from technical programming challenges to the best strategies for rare games. YouTube channels feature Jaguar gameplay, reviews, and technical deep dives. The console has transcended its commercial failure to become a beloved curiosity, a system that inspired devotion despite or perhaps because of its flaws. What makes the Jaguar homebrew renaissance significant is not the number of games or the size of the community. Both remain modest compared to more popular platforms. The significance lies in the dedication and skill displayed by developers working with difficult hardware for no commercial reward, purely out of love for the system. The homebrew scene proved that the Jaguar's failure wasn't due to technical inadequacy, but to inadequate support, poor timing, and resource constraints. Given proper tools, documentation, and time, developers could create excellent software for the console. The question was never, can the Jaguar run good games, but rather, will anyone invest the effort to make them? The homebrew community answered with an emphatic yes, keeping the console alive decades after its commercial death. The Atari Jaguar's legacy is complex and contradictory. As a commercial product, it was an unmitigated failure, selling poorly, losing money, and contributing to the demise of Atari Corporation. As a technical achievement, it represented ambitious engineering and creative architecture that, while flawed, demonstrated innovative approaches to console design. As a platform for games, it delivered a handful of excellent titles surrounded by mediocrity, potential glimpsed but never fully realized. And as a symbol, it represents the final, desperate attempt by a once great company to reclaim its former glory, a last stand that ended in defeat. The lessons learned from the Jaguar's failure influenced subsequent console generations. Sony's success with the PlayStation wasn't accidental. They studied previous failures, including the Jaguar, and built their strategy around what those failures revealed. Developer relations became a priority, with Sony providing excellent tools, generous licensing terms, and hands-on support. Sony invested heavily in building relationships with key developers, ensuring a steady flow of quality software. They marketed to adults as well as children, expanding the potential audience. They priced competitively and manufactured enough units to meet demand. Each decision addressed a problem that had sunk previous consoles. The Jaguar also influenced Microsoft's later approach to entering the console market with the Xbox in 2001. Microsoft recognized that competing with established players required massive resources, excellent developer support, and a killer app that demonstrated the hardware's capabilities. The original Xbox launched with Halo. Combat evolved. The system seller that the Jaguar never had. Microsoft absorbed billions in losses to establish the platform, recognizing that success required long-term commitment that Atari couldn't afford. The Xbox succeeded where the Jaguar failed, not because Microsoft was smarter, but because they had deeper pockets and learned from others' mistakes. The multi-chip architecture approach, while problematic for the Jaguar, would later find success in other forms. Modern gaming consoles and PCs use multiple processors, GPUs, specialized hardware for audio and physics, creating distributed systems not unlike what the Jaguar attempted. The difference is that modern development tools abstract away much of the complexity, allowing programmers to work at higher levels without managing every detail of processor coordination. The Jaguar's mistake wasn't the multi-chip approach itself, but exposing that complexity to developers without providing adequate tools to manage it. The what-ifs surrounding the Jaguar are tantalizing. What if Atari had delayed launch until more games were ready? What if they had provided better development tools from the start? What if they had focused on first-party software to build a library before courting third parties? What if they had positioned it as a 32-bit console rather than making dubious 64-bit claims? What if they had secured a killer app, a Halo, or a Super Mario 64 that justified purchasing the hardware? Each question opens alternate timelines where perhaps the Jaguar succeeded, or at least survived longer. One fascinating what-if concerns timing. If the Jaguar had launched in 1992 instead of late 1993, it would have enjoyed a longer window before the PlayStation and Saturn arrived. An earlier launch might have allowed Atari to build installed base, refine tools and documentation, and establish the platform before facing next-generation competition. Conversely, if they had waited until 1995 with a more mature hardware design and stronger launch library, they might have competed more effectively, though they would have faced Sony and Sega immediately. The 1993 launch was arguably the worst timing, too late to dominate the existing generation, but too early to match the next one. What if Atari had partnered with Sony instead of competing against them? This alternate history isn't as far-fetched as it might seem. Atari and Sony had worked together previously, with Sony manufacturing chips for Atari computers, a partnership where Sony provided CD-ROM technology and financial backing, while Atari contributed their hardware design and brand recognition, could have been mutually beneficial. Whether such a partnership would have succeeded is uncertain. Sony's eventual domination suggests they didn't need Atari, but it's an intriguing road not taken. The VR headset that never materialized represents perhaps the most fascinating what-if. Had Atari managed to release a functional virtual reality headset in 1994 or 1995, they would have beaten the rest of the industry to consumer VR by nearly 20 years. The technology wasn't ready for mainstream success, as later attempts like Nintendo's Virtual Boy would demonstrate. But as a high-end peripheral for enthusiasts, it might have given the Jaguar a unique selling proposition. We'll never know, but the existence of working prototypes suggests it was closer to reality than many might assume. What if key developers had created Jaguar versions of their flagship titles? Imagine if Square had released a Final Fantasy game, or if Capcom had ported Street Fighter II Turbo with the Jaguar's superior processing power. What if Nintendo, in a bizarre alternate timeline, had allowed their properties on Atari hardware? The lack of major franchises hurt the Jaguar immeasurably. The presence of even a handful of must-have exclusives might have changed its trajectory, attracting more developers and consumers in a positive feedback loop. The cultural impact of the Jaguar's failure extended beyond gaming. It marked the end of an era when companies like Atari could compete with limited resources. The PlayStation generation raised the stakes dramatically. Console development required billion-dollar commitments, extensive industry relationships, and tolerance for years of losses before profitability. The cottage industry approach that had worked in earlier generations couldn't compete with Sony, Nintendo, and later Microsoft. The Jaguar was one of the last gasps of the old model, before consolidation and massive resources became prerequisites for success. In gaming history, the Jaguar occupies a unique position. It's not celebrated like the Super Nintendo or PlayStation, but it's not forgotten like many obscure systems. It exists in a middle ground, remembered enough to be discussed, documented, and collected, but never to be mainstreamed into broader gaming consciousness. The Jaguar is a cult console loved by a dedicated few, respected by technical enthusiasts, and studied by those interested in why products fail despite potential. The homebrew community's ongoing work ensures the Jaguar won't fade entirely. As long as new games continue to release and enthusiasts maintain the hardware, the console lives on in a way its creators never imagined. This posthumous life, where the Jaguar exists as a hobbyist platform rather than commercial product, might be its truest purpose. Free from the pressures of profit and market share, the console can be appreciated for what it is rather than judged by what it failed to become. The homebrew renaissance has, in a sense, redeemed the Jaguar, proving its worth in the court of history if not in the marketplace of its time. The broader influence on console design and business strategy might be the Jaguar's most lasting legacy. By demonstrating what not to do through poor developer relations, inadequate tools, confusing marketing, and insufficient resources, the Jaguar taught the industry valuable lessons. Future console makers studied its failures alongside others' successes, building strategies that avoided the pitfalls that had sunk Atari. In this way, the Jaguar contributed to the maturation of the gaming industry, a cautionary tale that helped others chart more successful courses. The Atari Jaguar stands as a monument to ambition and tragedy. It represents what happens when vision exceeds resources, when innovative engineering meets inadequate support, when a company's dreams collide with market reality. The console story is fundamentally human, a tale of people trying to achieve something great, falling short, but leaving behind something that still matters decades later. The Jaguar failed, but it failed while reaching for something worthwhile. In the end, perhaps that's a more interesting legacy than simple success would have been. And so we come to the end of the Jaguar's story, a console born from desperation and ambition, launched into an unforgiving market, and killed by circumstances both within and beyond Atari's control. The black box with its distinctive cartridge slot and curious controller has passed into legend, remembered by those who believed in it, and studied by those who seek to understand why promising technology sometimes fails. The Jaguar reminds us that the history of technology is not a straight line of progress, but a tangled web of successes and failures, each teaching lessons for those who pay attention. It shows us that specifications on paper don't guarantee greatness in practice. It demonstrates that even the cleverest engineering requires adequate support to reach its potential. It proves that timing, marketing, and luck matter as much as innovation in determining what survives and what fades away. For those who owned a Jaguar, the memories linger. The first time loading Tempest 2000 and feeling the music pulse through you as the vectors spun. The tension of sneaking through corridors in Alien vs. Predator. Motion tracker beeping, knowing something horrible lurked nearby. The simple joy of discovering that the console, for all its flaws, could deliver moments of genuine gaming magic when everything aligned. These memories remain real and valuable, independent of sales figures or critical reception. The Jaguar made its mark on those who experienced it, and that mark endures. In the grand history of video games, the Atari Jaguar is a footnote, but it's a footnote worth reading. A small story within the larger narrative that adds depth and complexity to our understanding of how the industry evolved. The console's failure paved the way for others' success. The dreams that died with it were reborn in different forms in later generations. The engineers and developers who worked on it went on to create other things, carrying lessons learned from both triumph and tragedy. Nothing is truly wasted. Even failure teaches. The homebrew community ensures the Jaguar will never completely disappear. As long as enthusiasts preserve hardware, create new software and share knowledge, the console lives on in its own small way. It exists now not as a commercial product but as a piece of computing history, a puzzle for programmers to solve, a collectible for enthusiasts to treasure. This digital afterlife, where the Jaguar matters to a few rather than many, seems somehow appropriate. Some things are not meant for mass consumption. Some stories are for those who take the time to seek them out, to understand them, to appreciate their nuances. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you might dream of alternate timelines where things went differently, where the Jaguar launched with a killer app that justified its existence, where Atari's developers had the tools and time to fully realize the hardware's potential, where 64 bits meant something more than a marketing claim, where the console found its audience and survived into the late 1990s, evolving and improving, cementing Atari's place in the next generation. But even without those alternate timelines, the Jaguar that existed in our reality has value. It represents humanity's eternal drive to create, to innovate, to reach for something better, even when the odds are long and the resources limited. It shows us that ambition and failure can coexist, that something can be flawed yet still meaningful, that commercial success and historical significance are different measures. The Atari Jaguar failed as a product but succeeded as a story, and stories ultimately are what endure. So let your mind settle now. Let the weight of the day drain away. Let the glow of the screen fade as your eyes grow heavy. The Jaguar story is told, at least for tonight. The console rests in history, neither forgotten nor celebrated, but remembered by those who care. And that, perhaps, is enough. Tomorrow will bring new stories, new technologies, new dreams that might succeed or fail. But for now, just breathe. Just rest. The wild ride of the Atari Jaguar has ended. The dream has faded. But the memory lingers, soft and quiet, in the twilight of forgotten consoles and the hearts of those who still care. Thank you for journeying with me through the rise and fall of Atari's last console. If you enjoyed this exploration into computing history, I invite you to like, subscribe, and share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below. Every story matters, even the ones about failure, especially those stories. Good night, sleepy computer scientists. May your dreams be filled with smooth frame rates, perfect code, and consoles that lived up to their promise. The Jaguar may not have achieved its 64-bit dreams, but we can dream on its behalf. Rest well. End of script. Total word count, approximately 15,800 words across all 4 parts.